The culture war throws up all kinds of absurdities. So this week, there was the spectacle of an overweight man winning a Miss America beauty pageant. There's the image. Now, if you don't think that that is misogynistic, just ask yourself one question. Do you think for a second that a woman of that size would get anywhere near a beauty pageant, let alone win it? And the answer, of course, is no. And the reason he won is because he identifies as a woman. And that, of course, must be validated, even if it's at the expense of women. And look, I don't think anyone should be body-shamed or made to feel bad about how they look, but you can't just identify as beautiful in order to win some prizes, right? I'm terrible at sports, but I can't just claim to be an athlete and demand a place at the Olympics. You know, perhaps the culture war should really be called the age of entitlement. This is a period in which individual emotions are prioritised over objective reality. And activists no longer need to persuade anyone of their point of view. They just have to use accusations of bigotry as a form of blackmail to get their own way. So if you just look at the way that Just Stop Oil activists are behaving, so they're disrupting people's working days, putting lives at risk, vandalising artwork and buildings. And of course, there's a legitimate debate to be had over climate change and how we might better tackle it. But simply making demands without attempting to persuade is not going to work. Look at this interview with a Just Stop Oil activist from just the other day.
Politics has failed us. I'm 28. This is the 27th COP conference. And what has happened every single year? The emissions have risen and risen and risen. If you were doing your job properly, everyone would be out on the street.
So we have
but they're not. And I really want you to understand.
No,
do you know how grave the situation is?
I do understand.
And do you have children?
I've got children.
And do you love those children?
Indigo, please.
Now, when was the last time you were persuaded by being shouted at? And why is it the most vociferous activists are always so posh? And that one is called Indigo Rumbelow. And I'm not even making that up. It's like when those posh kids were put on trial in Bristol for pulling down the statue of Edward Colston. I mean, one of them was called Milo Ponsford. Another was called Sage Willoughby. Why is it that aristocrats are always the ones lecturing everyone else about privilege? I suppose we could call this the Prince Harry effect. But sometimes the activists cross a line, and sometimes it stops being funny. You know, sometimes their authoritarianism is just too blatantly expressed. And we can see how dangerous these culture warriors actually are. So this week, a sign appeared at the Institute of Contemporary Music Performance in London. And it read, "What is a TERF? Trans-exclusionary radical feminist ideology is a specific form of transphobia. The primary TERF assertion is that trans women are not women and accordingly have no place in women's spaces." And then there was an option to report anyone expressing such views and a QR code to make it easier. Now, what are we to make of this? Well, let's leave aside the Stasi-like nature of reporting people for wrongthink and the fact that TERF is really just a synonym for witch, and go straight to the fact that a college has no business attempting to police the personal opinions of its staff and students. It's not morally right, and it's also probably illegal. So the sign describes the belief that sex is immutable as an ideology. But biological reality is not an ideology. This is what we might call projection, because it is, of course, the denial of biological sex differences that is the true ideological position. And note how this sign frames this view as a radical extremist fringe position. And there's just one problem with that. It's the position held by the majority of the public. So why would an elite college pretend otherwise? Well, this is a tactic we've seen before. So the journalist Louis Staples once claimed that J.K. Rowling had been radicalised online. Now, her radicalisation amounted to a belief that there are biological differences between men and women. So who has really been radicalised here? Is it the person who accepts the reality that has been known and understood throughout human history? Or is it the kind of person who would do this? Now, that is someone burning some Harry Potter books on a barbecue. Now, I would suggest that burning books because you don't agree with some of the author's opinions is somewhat unhinged, as is sending endless death and rape threats to the author. So if it's online radicalisation we're talking about, then surely these are the kinds of things that we might be looking for, not just a statement about the biological reality that there are differences between men and women. It's important to remember that the culture warriors really are a minority in every generation, but because they hold disproportionate control over our major institutions like the Institute of Contemporary Music Performance, they can pretend that the minority view represents the consensus, and that those who hold the majority view are heretics who ought to be reported. These are ideologues who will accuse you of being ideological if you don't adhere to their belief system. Let's have another look at that sign. The second part of this sign says, this ideology, there's that word again, also affects trans men, as TERFs assert that people assigned female at birth but identify as male shouldn't be allowed into women's spaces either. Now, this is palpably false. Feminists simply have never made this claim at all. And so what this suggests is that whoever made the sign doesn't understand the point of view that he or she is attempting to demonise. And that shouldn't surprise us. But these culture warriors don't believe in debate. And so they never hear what the other side has to say. They have decided that it is hateful and transphobic to state biological facts. And you can't really reason with such an extreme stance. And this is why the culture war is so bad for society, because its proponents are essentially authoritarian, tearing down statues, burning books, deplatforming speakers, cancelling people for wrongthink, demanding the dismantling of women's spaces. They want to force their values onto everyone else. No discussion, no compromise, it's their way or nothing. Democracy is outdated. It's time for a new form of tyranny imposed by a privileged and elite class that pretends to be victimised. And worryingly, this mentality is catching on. There was a recent poll by JL Partners that revealed that 61% of 18 to 34-year-olds in the UK would favour, quote, a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Parliament or elections. That's called a dictator. And although in the history of humankind there may have been the occasional benevolent dictator, for the most part they haven't worked out too well. But culture warriors have forgotten that a plurality of views isn't something to be feared, it's a sign of a healthy society. So rather than shouting at people who take a different view, or calling them monsters or fascists or whatever other epithet springs to mind, let's restore the necessity for debate and discussion and, yes, disagreement. To put it another way, everyone just needs to grow up.